So here we are with Andrew on the screen here, and we're going to put his two ideas in two different corners here, and you'll see why in a bit. So his idea, again, was to make as much money as possible and then to give it away. So he did the first part, and he did it really well. He cornered the market on steel, just as the Industrial Revolution was kicking into full gear, as the railroads got built out, as steel was the key ingredient to the growth of the economy. His company was called Carnegie Steel. In 1901, he sold it to J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan formed it into U.S. Steel, which still exists. And then in terms of giving it away, these are some pictures at the time. These are some cartoons from the newspapers showing off this crazy guy who was super rich, who was giving away his money, right? This was a new idea. It was such a new idea. It was being both lampooned and shown off at the same time, right? They didn't really know what to make of this because it really hadn't been done before. When we say he gave it away, he couldn't just form a single foundation and hand it its money and give it away, because there was no such thing as a foundation back then. We'll talk about corporations in another week in this series. So he formed a corporation. He formed the Carnegie Corporation of New York. That's the organization that does the libraries. But he also formed the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and one for science. And there's an international award. I am an alumni of Carnegie Mellon University, so I'm part of this legacy of fortune. And there's more. This is just the top, the biggest of his organizations. So what falls out of this is interesting. So he was the first that did this, and then he got John Rockefeller to do the same thing, and the Rockefeller Foundation still exists and still giving away Rockefeller's money. And a whole bunch of others followed along. We'll see them later in this story as well. And so now we're in a world where we have huge philanthropists. We have these giant foundations and giant global charities. And what's happened over the years since 1901, 1911, is that now we expect that poverty and hunger and global health and all those other big global issues, right, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we expect those to be solved by the philanthropists and the governments, right? We're no longer expected as private individuals or as corporations or as anything else to go and solve those problems. We don't expect those problems to solve themselves. We turn to the philanthropists to solve those problems. And that's an unintended consequence of Carnegie's invention. This idea that the hard problems of the world are the area that philanthropy should play in, right? And only philanthropy, which is not true. This book shows up in a lot of my lessons. This book helps explain why we're stuck with that as an idea and how hard it will be to unstick that idea from the world. And what's crazy about saying that with this book is this book has nothing to do with philanthropy or investing or money. It's not a book on economics. It's not a book on anything related to this. It's actually a book about the history of science. And the reason I pull this up is that despite the fact that maybe one or two of you on this call have ever actually seen this book or opened it or maybe even read it, the fact is that everybody on this call knows what's in this book. This is the book that invented the term paradigm. This is another great example. We just think paradigm has been around forever, right? Paradigm, this idea of paradigms, must have been around for hundreds of years. No, it came from this book in 1968, 65, 60 something. This book's barely older than me. It's just over 50 years old. And the idea of a paradigm is you have a set of beliefs, and when you have some evidence that goes against those beliefs, you ignore it. Like, we think that science would just accept all the new data and process it and whatnot, but that's not what science really does. Science just ignores things until they can't ignore them anymore. Same thing happens in politics. Same things happens in the rest of life. And so how do we get out of our paradigm? We're stuck in a paradigm where philanthropy has to solve poverty, and philanthropy can't solve poverty. And I'll show you why in a minute. So on these two corners of Andrew Carnegie's invention, so we have make the most money in the top left corner, give it away in the bottom right corner. So we call the top one, in terms of this topic of investing, right? We're in an investing workshop here. We'll call the top one investing, right? So Carnegie was an entrepreneur. Somebody invested in his company and they did well. He put in his sweat equity. He did well. and then he gave it all away again. It's philanthropy. And these things, they seem to be far apart. They seem to be totally separate. Part of the paradigm is that you have two pockets. Part of the paradigm is if you're rich, well, you have your investing money in one pocket, and that pocket's supposed to make the most money possible. And then you take a little bit out and you put it in your other pocket, and that's the pocket that you give to charity. Right? That's your philanthropic pocket.